Joining us now, MS Now White House correspondent Akayla Gardner, MS Now political contributor and editor-at-large for the 19th, Aaron Hayes, former Pennsylvania Congressman Charlie Dent, and former special assistant to President Biden and former director of White House message planning, Megan Hayes. All right, I'm going to start with you, Akayla, because you wrote a piece for MS Now on this very subject. So give us a sense of what you found and what you're keeping an eye on.
And Tony, I feel like you laid it out so well. I found two parties that are facing two very different but still very daunting challenges going into 2028. For Republicans, it's grappling with the fact that President Trump likely won't be on the ballot in 2028. He has flirted with what would be an unconstitutional third term, but his latest line is that he's not doing that. And he has largely talked about J.D. Vance, as well as his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, as sort of a dream team. He's called them unstoppable if they were to be on top of the ticket. But if Vance were to run, he would have to overcome some of the baggage of the current administration, which right now looks like the economy. The White House continues to struggle with convincing voters that they can handle the affordability crisis. And then for Democrats, they're really rebuilding their coalition. We saw Democrats lose ground with nearly every single demographic group in 2024. They're going to have to prove they can get those voters back. And Karen Finney, she's a Democratic operative, really emphasized the need for Democrats to succeed in the online ecosystem. She recommended that Democrats get on podcasts, even some of the more niche podcasts, that Republicans have been really successful in continuing to invest in digital strategy and outreach, even in off years. So there's really a long path to 2028, but we're already seeing candidates laying the groundwork right now, courting donors, courting allies, and really trying to get their name IDs up.
Congressman Dent, I'm curious how you think J.D. Vance is going to try to separate himself from some of the troubles facing President Trump right now. And I ask because there's sort of this question around him sometimes of personality and charisma. Trump himself says that he owns this movement that he's built. It's very closely identified with his personality, his family even. And, you know, some of the names I didn't mention include his sons who could throw their hat in the ring here, too. So I'm curious if you think J.D. Vance will be able to tap into the parts of Trump that really do work with their base, that people are very emotionally invested in and attached to, or if he'll be seen as not quite as authentically owning that movement.
Well, I think the real challenge for whoever the GOP nominee will be in 2028 is that they're going to be trying to run for Donald Trump's third term. And it'll be very hard in the case of the vice president to separate himself from Trump. And if Donald Trump's approval ratings continue to be pretty low, and they are low, particularly on the economy, around 36%, that is going to be an enormous problem. I mean, remember, Hillary Clinton more or less ran in 2016, for the third term of Barack Obama, and his approval ratings were pretty respectable at that time. So I think that's really the fundamental challenge for Vance and for any Republican. How do you draw some separation? How do you keep that base together? But at the end of the day, it's probably going to be another change election. The likelihood. I mean, what they'll probably end up doing, they'll be praying that the Democrats go far left and nominate somebody like a Mondami or an AOC or somebody out of the Sanders wing of the party. That would make them competitive. But right now, they have to come up with a real answer how to separate themselves when you have a president with such a low approval rating. And his approval rating might improve by the end of his term. Who knows? Or it could stay where it is or get worse.
Yeah, Trump has climbed back and beaten the odds before. That's for sure. Megan, I want to ask you on the Democratic side of things. In the last election or sort of a couple election cycles, I would say, there's been criticism at times around Democratic candidates that all they can kind of position themselves is as an alternative to Trump. We're anti-Trump. We're going to reverse what Trump has done. And that young voters, maybe sort of lower propensity voters, they want to know more about what Democrats actually stand for, Trump aside. Do you think the Democratic Party is ready to articulate that kind of moral clarity and vision this time around?
I think you're already starting to see that with the midterms and some of the fights with healthcare. in the last year. So I think that you're already starting to see a lot of that from the Democratic Party, which is great, because I do think that just talking about what you stand for isn't enough anymore. People want to hear solutions. People want to hear what you're actually going to do and how you are going to do it. So I think we're to the point right now, as people are seeing with Trump, talk is cheap. And so if the Democrats want to win back the coalition that they lost in 24, or at least part of it, they're going to have to come up with real solutions moving into the midterms and then beyond to win the 28 cycle. So, it's interesting if people are going to want to turn the page on a Trump Vance, and JD Vance will be suffering from Donald Trump's approval rating, or they're going to want to go, like Charlie Dent said, with a change election.
Erin, what are you seeing among the Democrats? I know that you know candidates or potential candidates like Vice President Harris well. You've interviewed and spoken to many of these folks. So who do you have your eye on, and who do you think is best positioned to tell that story, that change election story, the best?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly people do have, kind of PTSD from 2024, but former Vice President Harris has been on this book tour. She's been listening to people across the country. Memoirs are usually a pretty good indicator that you're at least interested or exploring it, right? Regardless of whether that means you're actually going to end up running. I think, for her, you see that she's scheduled these additional book tour dates. So she's going to keep kind of putting herself out there, inserting herself into the news cycle and into our politics and really trying to gauge where the electorate is right now. But, I think that also we are kind of beyond the point where we have presidential cycles where we won't see a woman running. So even if it is not Kamala Harris, I think we are potentially looking at, other high profile women who are qualified, who are talented to contest for the presidency, whether we're talking about an AOC or a Gina Raimondo or, maybe a Gretchen Whitmer, Amy Klobuchar, who ran for president before. There are a lot of women that could also be on that list. But I think also to Akayla's point, definitely keeping an eye on who's going to hit that podcast circuit again. We saw how influential that was in 2024 as a way of introducing voters to potential candidates in a way that kind of gets around politics, but gets them, humanizes them, and introduces them to the American public.
Megan, do you think the Democrats would feel comfortable putting another woman forward after what happened in 2024?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Democrats are smart enough to realize that gender doesn't matter. We need to put forth the best candidate, and the best candidate that's going to meet voters where they are, that's going to be willing to do the podcast, that's going to be willing to be out there and be boots on the ground and talking to people and really listening to what people want and coming up with good solutions. So absolutely, Democrats could nominate another woman.
I'm curious, Congressman, if you have your eye on any sort of dark horse contenders on the right. I think people assume that Ted Cruz, who's wanted to be president for quite a while, will try again. We heard even the president say before Rubio's name there and alongside JD's. But do you think there's a possibility here that there could be a surprising figure who challenges JD even from the right, instead of the more sort of traditional center and sort of legacy Republicans, someone who we may not even have our eye on right now?
Well, I always like to watch out for governors because a lot of governors can stand up and say that they're really not part of the Washington mess, the swamp. And whoever that governor would be, Republican governor, they could point to Vance and Rubio and others and saying, hey, you are all part of the swamp. You're part of the problem. We need to get somebody from outside Washington. So I always watch for that kind of a message. But to follow up on what your previous guest just spoke about on the gender issue, Republicans have to really focus more on women than they have. I mean, if you look what happened in 2024, I believe Republicans lost women by about 8 points, and I think in Virginia and in New Jersey, and then lost them by 21 points in the recent off-year election. So there are some issues here that Republicans are going to have to shore up long before 2028. In 2026, for example, they're going to have to they're not going to be able to replicate the 2024 turnout model. They want to bring out these Trump-only voters. They're not going to be able to do it. And they're going to also have to figure out these ACA subsidies, which are going to really hurt them with independent voters. I think the GOP probably knows that. So they have a lot of work to do between now and the midterm, let alone 2028. But I keep saying, watch out for a governor. They always like to be able to say they're the outsider.
Akayla, I want to hear more about what you're hearing from sources at the White House, too, because as the congressman just did a good job spelling out there, the Republicans have a whole bunch of hurdles that they're already facing. I mean, because of tariffs and their anger at the economy, the feeling that people feel poorer and poorer all the time. They're not getting raises, or if they don't have a job, they're having an incredibly difficult time getting one. But add to that 20+ million Americans now already here facing these massive premium hikes. They're going to be watching Washington and wondering why Republicans haven't been able to figure out a deal when they've had years to work on a proposal or an alternative here. So all of this is going to come together and hit their side really hard. We've heard a bit of Trump saying, this rebranding of affordability to it's going to be all about pricing. But what more do you know about the strategy, where they're going to send people, how they're going to try to keep this whole thing together?
Well, it's no secret that this White House continues to struggle with public perception about the economy. President Trump and J.D. Vance are expected to hit the campaign trail this year. They're going to be going across the country campaigning for Republicans and trying to sell their version of the economy and what they believe is their accomplishments. The White House is really hinging on the tax cuts that we're going to see later this year kicking in to make sure that Americans feel somewhat better about the economy. But something that Charlie brought up was really interesting. I feel as though it's good to mention is the fact that, we had the Epstein Files issues hit such a nerve with the MAGA base. We obviously saw Marjorie Taylor Greene now leaving Congress, and you also had Nancy Mace really criticizing the administration's handling of this case. And what I've heard talking to voters, people at Trump's rallies, is this is an issue that has really struck a nerve. And I think this is a problem for them continuously, that women, particularly women, MAGA Republicans, continue to say that this is an issue for them. And I think they're becoming some of the loudest critics. And there is concerns that perhaps President Donald Trump tried to silence people like Marjorie Taylor Greene on an issue that has so deeply impacted so many women, more than 1,000 victims when it comes to Jeffrey Epstein.